There are people inside royal palaces who are never photographed, never quoted, and never asked for their opinion. They carry bags, they arrange schedules, they answer telephones at hours that would break ordinary people. They stand 3 feet away from private conversations and pretend not to hear. They pour the wine and leave the room. They know things, and the things they know do not always match the story the rest of the world has been told. For years, the official version of Camilla Parker Bowles was a simple one. She was the other woman, the intruder, the reason a fairy tale had gone wrong. The public had decided, and the public is rarely interested in revisions. Photographs captured her in unflattering angles. Headlines used her name like a weapon. When Charles and Diana's marriage finally collapsed in full public view, Camilla was standing in the wreckage with no good explanation and no serious defenders. And yet, behind the walls of the places where she actually existed, the private homes, the country houses, the quiet rooms where staff worked and watched and formed their own judgments, a different picture was emerging. It was not the picture the tabloids wanted. It was not the picture Diana's supporters were willing to consider. It was something more complicated and in many ways more revealing about the nature of loyalty, love, and what it actually takes to survive inside the most scrutinized family in the world. This is the story of what the people who served Charles really thought of Camilla, not what they said in public, not the careful diplomatic phrases polished for cameras, what they thought when they were among themselves, when they believed no one important was listening, when the workday was done and the masks could be set aside for a moment. It begins not with Camilla herself, but with the household she was entering. By the time Camilla Parker Bowles became a permanent, undeniable presence in Charles' official life, his household had already survived years of extraordinary strain. The men and women who staffed Highgrove, St. James's Palace, and later Clarence House were not ordinary employees. They had been selected through channels of recommendation and quiet vetting that went back generations. They understood discretion the way other people understand breathing, not as a choice, but as a condition of their own survival. You did not gossip, you did not confide, you did not take what you saw inside those walls and carry it out into the world. If you did, you were finished, and everyone around you knew it. The staff during the years of Charles and Diana's marriage had witnessed things that no outsider could fully comprehend. They had watched a beautiful, celebrated couple unravel in real time. They had navigated the impossible politics of a household divided not into 2 sides but into several, those loyal to Charles, those loyal to Diana, those trying desperately to serve both without appearing to serve either. They had answered calls that came at strange hours. They had moved through rooms thick with tension and learned the specific art of looking at the floor at precisely the right moment. They had collectively endured. And so when Camilla began to appear with greater frequency, not as the hidden connection but as the acknowledged partner, eventually the woman Charles intended to marry, these were not people encountering her for the first time. They were people who had watched the preceding decade from closer than anyone comfortable with proximity should ever have to stand. Their opinions of her were not formed in a single moment. They were formed across years of small observations, accumulated in the way all serious judgments are, quietly, privately, and without much room for sentimentality. What those observations produced was not the verdict the public expected. The first thing that surprised people who had spent time around Camilla was how little she resembled the figure the press had constructed. The tabloid version was imperious, calculating, coolly indifferent to the wreckage she left behind. She arrived in hostile spaces and dared them to resist her. She had won in the crude arithmetic of romantic scandal, and she wore the victory openly. The reality was considerably less dramatic. Staff who encountered her in those early years of open acknowledgement, the years when Charles was slowly normalizing her presence, when she was appearing at public events, learning the rhythms of royal life, described something different. She was not cold, she was not theatrical. She did not sweep through rooms demanding attention or reorganize the domestic order to suit herself. She seemed, in the assessment of people paid to observe exactly this kind of thing, to be trying quite hard not to be a nuisance. This surprised them. It should not have, perhaps, but it did. The expectation had been shaped by years of hostile coverage and the understandable sympathies that had formed around Diana. The expectation was someone who had fought for this position and now intended to occupy it with the full force of a person who had won. What they found instead was a woman who seemed more preoccupied with not disrupting the existing order than with imposing a new one. She learned names. This was noticed. In households like Charles's, where staff rotated and positions carried specific functions, the failure of principals to learn names was a known and accepted grievance. Diana had been celebrated for it. Her genuine warmth with staff was one of the most frequently cited aspects of her personality by people who had served her. Camilla's approach was quieter and less celebrated, because Camilla was not operating in a context where anyone was ready to celebrate her for anything. But the staff noticed it anyway. She asked questions about people's families. She remembered the answers. When she encountered the same person 2 weeks later, she demonstrated in small and unremarkable ways that the first conversation had actually registered. For people who spent their professional lives being professionally invisible, this was not a small thing. There were specific incidents that circulated among the domestic staff at Highgrove, not as gossip exactly, but as stories told to explain a larger truth. One that appeared in more than one account involved a weekend visit in the early days of Camilla's acknowledged presence at the estate. The household had prepared for a formal dinner, and as sometimes happens in these situations, something went wrong in the kitchen. Not catastrophically wrong, the kind of wrong that in an ordinary household would be managed quickly and quietly. In a royal household where every detail is a potential source of reproach, mistakes tend to land differently. What Camilla did, and this is the part that people remembered, was nothing. She noticed the situation. She said something quietly reassuring to the person most obviously distressed. She did not make it a moment. She did not demand explanation or compensation. She moved on, and by doing so she allowed everyone else to move on. This sounds like a small thing. In royal households, it is not. The capacity to give staff room to make mistakes, to absorb minor disasters without transforming them into evidence of someone's inadequacy, is rarer than it should be. Charles, for all his genuine kindness and deep concern for the people around him, could be particular in ways that created anxiety. His attention to detail, his strong preferences, his tendency to communicate those preferences with great precision, these were not cruelties, but they produced a certain watchfulness in the people who served him, a permanent alertness to the possibility of falling short. Camilla, it became clear over time, had a different relationship with imperfection. She did not expect perfection. She was, in ways that staff found disarming, sympathetic to the experience of things not going exactly right. Whether this came from her own experience navigating years of public hostility and private difficulty, or simply from temperament, the effect was the same. The people who worked around her felt, over time, less braced. This observation did not translate easily into public admiration. The qualities that make someone pleasant to work for, ease, tolerance, the absence of constant judgment, are not the qualities that produce spectacular press coverage. They are felt, not photographed. They register in the way a room's atmosphere registers when a difficult person has left it, not in anything specific enough to write a headline about. But among the staff, these qualities accumulated into something like a reputation. The reputation was not the one the public had assigned her. It was built from different evidence. If you're finding this story compelling, take a moment right now to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We spend a long time researching these histories, the ones that don't make the headlines but change everything about how you understand the people who do. There's much more ahead in this story, and you won't want to miss where it goes. Not everyone, it should be said, arrived at the same conclusion. Royal households are not monolithic, and the people who worked within them brought their own histories and loyalties to their observations. Those who had been closest to Diana, who had loved her with the particular devotion that her warmth inspired in people who saw her at her best, found it difficult to extend the same openness to the woman they associated, rightly or wrongly, with Diana's misery. The emotional accounting of the marriage's failure had never been completed, and in the corridors of Charles's household, it never quite would be. There were members of staff who remained cool to Camilla throughout, not through rudeness or open hostility. That was not how these things were expressed in these environments, but through a certain permanent reserve, a quality of politeness so perfectly calibrated that it communicated exactly the distance it was intended to communicate. They were professional, they were efficient, they gave her nothing to complain about and nothing to feel warmly toward. It was a kind of managed absence, and in an environment where warmth was the most precise signal of genuine acceptance, its absence was meaningful. These individuals were not wrong to feel what they felt. Grief does not follow logical schedules. Loyalty does not expire simply because the person it was attached to is no longer alive. The staff who had watched Diana in her private hours, who had seen her cry, who had sat with her through the darker periods, who had been the recipients of the extraordinary directness she showed the people she trusted, carried something that could not simply be reassigned. It was not transferable. But what was interesting, and what became clearer as years passed, was that even among this group, among those who would never fully close the distance, a grudging acknowledgement began to form. It came slowly, and it was never offered generously. It was the kind of admission people make when the evidence has become too consistent to keep dismissing. She was not, they conceded, what they had expected. She was not difficult. She was not demanding. She did not arrive with a reformer's agenda or a conqueror's entitlement. She worked in her particular way to make the household function rather than to reorganize it around herself. She had opinions, but she expressed them in contexts where it was appropriate to have opinions, rather than as a constant broadcast of her own importance. She understood, or had learned, when to speak and when the more useful thing was silence. This was not forgiveness. It was not warmth. It was the specific, limited assessment that people make when they are honest enough to separate what they feel from what they observe. They observed, even those who could never fully accept her, that she was not making things worse. In the context she had entered, that was a more significant verdict than it might appear. The question that staff found themselves returning to, in various forms, over the years, was one that had no comfortable answer. It was the question about Charles. The people who served Charles had, over the long arc of their service, developed highly specific and largely private views about what he needed in order to function at his best. He was a complex employer, genuinely thoughtful, in many ways genuinely kind, possessed of enthusiasms that could be infectious and commitments that were real. He cared about things that powerful men often only pretend to care about. His concern for the environment, for architecture, for organic farming, for the preservation of traditional craftsmanship, these were not positions adopted for public consumption. They were beliefs held with intensity and acted upon with personal investment. He was also, in ways that his staff understood clearly, a man who required a particular kind of stability in his private life in order to function in his public one. The years of the marriage to Diana had demonstrated this in the most painful way possible. A Charles in private turmoil was a Charles more prone to the anxieties that had always shadowed him, the self-doubt, the difficulty making decisions, the tendency to be paralyzed by the gap between his own high standards and the imperfect reality of outcomes. A Charles with his emotional life in disorder was, in practical terms, harder to serve. What his staff observed as Camilla became a settled and acknowledged presence was a change. It was not dramatic. There was no single morning on which he was visibly transformed. It was cumulative, the way most real changes are. He was, over time, steadier. He was more decisive. The anxious restlessness that had characterized some of his worst periods, the pacing, the excessive revision of already revised plans, the private misery that seeped into every aspect of the household's functioning, became less constant. The staff did not theorize about this. They were not interested in theorizing. They were interested in what it meant for the daily work of serving him, and what it meant was that the work became, in certain specific ways, easier. Not because Camilla intervened in the running of the household, not because she reorganized anything or replaced anyone or made demands that disrupted existing arrangements, but because the man at the center of the household was more himself, and a more settled Charles was a more manageable Charles, and a more manageable Charles was, in the end, a more effective one. This observation carried its own discomfort for some of the people who made it. To acknowledge that Camilla's presence improved Charles's functioning was to acknowledge something about the marriage that had preceded her full acknowledgement, and about the woman who had occupied the role of wife through those years. It was not an observation that invited easy expression. It sat with people quietly, in the category of things understood but not spoken. We're about halfway through this story, and the most revealing part is still ahead. If you haven't already, please subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making these long-form documentaries about the hidden histories of royal life. And if you're watching on YouTube, the like button tells the algorithm that stories like this are worth surfacing. Now, back to what happened next. The marriage itself, the announcement, the period of preparation, the wedding on the 9th of April 2005, was a moment that tested the accumulated judgments of everyone who had been watching. For the staff who had spent years forming opinions in the privacy of their professional distance, the formalization of what had always been the reality created a new kind of pressure. The unofficial position was no longer available. Camilla was now, in the precise language of royal title, Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Cornwall. She was not a background presence or an acknowledged companion. She was, in the full legal and ceremonial sense, there. The staff adjusted. This is what staff do, and in royal households the adjustment is rarely conspicuous because conspicuousness would itself be a kind of comment. The protocols were learned. The new forms of address were practiced until they felt natural, because in this environment, practice makes performance indistinguishable from sincerity, and that indistinguishability is what the institution requires. But underneath the adjustment, the opinions that had been forming for years were now being tested by closer and more sustained observation. Now there was no buffer of distance, no managed separation between Camilla's world and the working household. She was inside the daily reality of it, present in ways that extended beyond weekend visits and special occasions, into the grinding ordinary texture of institutional life. What people found was broadly consistent with what they had observed before. She did not transform. There was no revelation of a concealed true nature, no emergence of the imperious figure the tabloids had always suggested was waiting beneath a calculated surface. She was, in the private estimation of the people who watched her most closely, essentially the same as she had been when her presence was unofficial. The title had changed. Her manner had not. She dealt with correspondence in ways that the staff found considerate, specific acknowledgments where acknowledgment was deserved, prompt responses to things that required promptness, a general sense that she understood the administrative labor that went into keeping everything functioning. She did not treat the people around her as invisible mechanisms. She treated them as people, which in environments where the alternative is common registered. She had by all accounts a genuine sense of humor. Dry, self-deprecating, occasionally sharp in ways that startled people who had expected either frigidity or excessive effort to charm. She did not perform warmth. She expressed something that the people around her generally identified as the real article, quieter and less spectacular than Diana's version had been, but consistent in a way that performance rarely sustains across the full span of ordinary working days. There were more difficult observations too. People who genuinely attempted fair assessment of Camilla did not pretend that her arrival into Charles's public life had been without costs, or that those costs had been distributed fairly. The position she occupied had been carved out of another person's place, and the staff who had served during those years had not forgotten what that displacement had looked like from the inside. Some of those people spoke carefully about the strangeness of watching Charles with Camilla compared to watching him with Diana. The differences were not what the narrative had conditioned people to expect. The marriage to Diana had been, in private, characterized by a specific kind of brightness and a specific kind of darkness that lived very close together. Diana's luminosity was real. The staff who had loved her were not wrong about that. But the household had also carried a weight during those years that not everyone chose to discuss openly. The weight of a marriage that was not working, sustained by two people who had been trained to believe that public duty required private performance regardless of private reality. With Camilla, the brightness was different, less spectacular, but the household did not carry the same weight, and some of the people who had been present for both could not help but notice that the current version of Charles, the one who moved through his days with more steadiness, who seemed less frequently at war with himself, who laughed more easily, was in some observable sense more capable of the work he was supposed to be doing. This was a complicated thing to acknowledge, and most people who acknowledged it did so quietly, in the specific register of someone sharing an observation they have tested against their own reluctance and found stubborn. not because they had resolved the ethical questions about how Charles and Camilla's relationship had developed, what it had cost, whose unhappiness had purchased whose happiness. These were not resolved by the evidence of a well-functioning household. They never would be. But the staff were not ethicists. They were people who had been watching for a long time, and what they had watched was a man they knew well becoming, year by year, more himself. And the woman most responsible for that change was not what they had been told to expect. When Charles became king in September 2022, when Queen Elizabeth II died at Balmoral and the long-anticipated transition finally arrived, the household entered a new phase that tested every adaptation that had been made over the preceding years. A duchy household and a royal court are not the same institution. The scale changed, the visibility changed, the weight of history that now settled on Charles's shoulders was of a different category entirely, and the people around him felt it. Camilla's role changed with it. She was now Queen Consort, the title that had for years been officially described as a destination she would not reach had, through a combination of genuine public shift and institutional realism, become her actual destination. She was queen, not in the full constitutional sense that Elizabeth II had been, but in the ceremonial, functional, and deeply symbolic sense that the world understood. The people who watched her navigate this transition were not universally prepared to say they had always known it would end here. That would have required more prescience than honest people claim, but many of them were prepared to say, in the careful language of people who choose their words by habit, that she had grown into the role in ways that suggested the role had not surprised her. She had been preparing not in any scheming or self-promotional sense, but in the way that observant people prepare when they are paying genuine attention to what a position requires. She had watched, she had learned, she had absorbed over years the specific texture of institutional life at the highest level, the protocols and pressures and public-facing demands, in a way that meant when the title finally matched the reality, the gap between the two was smaller than it might have been. The staff observed this. They noted the composure during the period of mourning, not cold composure, but the particular kind that comes from understanding what the occasion requires and being willing to subordinate personal feeling to it. They noted the adjustment to the expanded household, the learning curve managed without visible panic. They noted, in perhaps the most telling detail, that Charles seemed, in the midst of the most consequential transition of his life, in the grief and the ceremony and the overwhelming machinery of royal succession, not alone. For people who had watched him for years, who knew what aloneness had looked like on him in the past, that was a specific and significant observation. We're almost at the end of this story, and I want to ask you something before we reach the final verdict. If this kind of documentary, the kind that goes behind the official record and tries to find the human reality, is something you value, please share it. Send it to someone who loves royal history, post it somewhere, add it to a playlist. The best way to help this channel keep doing what it does is to put these stories in front of people who will genuinely appreciate them. Thank you. Now, to the final chapter. What is the verdict then? What did the people who served Charles, who watched Camilla across the years of her unofficial and then official presence, who formed their opinions without cameras and without the pressure of public positioning, what did they actually conclude? The answer is not simple, and any version of it that is simple should be treated with suspicion. Royal households do not produce simple conclusions. They produce the kind of ambivalent, qualified, hard-earned assessments that come from watching complicated people live complicated lives at very close range. What the evidence suggests, drawn from the accounts of those who served during the relevant years, who spoke in the cautious but ultimately revealing way that people with long institutional memories speak when they are being honest, is something like this. Camilla Parker Bowles was not what the public narrative said she was. She was not the cold strategist of tabloid construction, nor was she the tragic romantic of her supporters' telling, nor was she the obvious villain of Diana's story. She was, in the private assessment of the people who knew her work rather than her image, a woman who understood something important about what the position she occupied required, and who was willing to do the less glamorous work of actually meeting those requirements. She was not universally loved. That would be too neat, and the staff of royal households are not sentimental people. Some of them never fully closed the distance. Some maintained the professional reserve that was the only honest expression of feelings they were too disciplined to express otherwise. Those people are not wrong to be included in this account. Their position was earned by their own experience, and it speaks to a truth about the costs of how things happened that comfortable narratives tend to minimize. But the broader picture, the picture that emerges when the individual accounts are gathered and the patterns are traced, is of a woman who surprised people, who was warmer than expected, who was more considerate than the evidence of her public reputation had prepared people to find, who did not behave, in the ordinary ongoing texture of institutional life, like a person who had fought her way to a position and was now going to make everyone else feel the weight of it, and who made Charles, difficult, anxious, brilliant, particular Charles, more himself. That last observation is perhaps the most significant of all, and the most honest. The people who served him knew him well enough to understand what he needed in order to function at his best. They had watched what happened when that was absent. They observed what changed when it was present. Their verdict on Camilla was, at its foundation, a verdict about what they saw that presence do to the man at the center of everything. He was, they concluded, better with her. Not perfect. Neither of them was that, and the household knew too much to mistake functioning well for being without flaw. But better, steadier, more capable of doing the work that had been given to him. For people whose job was to support that work, that observation settled, over time, into something they were willing to defend, not loudly, not in ways that invited argument, in the private, durable way that real assessments settle, not because the questions had been answered, but because the evidence had been long enough in view to trust. The public version of Camilla had been written in headlines. The private version was written in years of small moments, witnessed by people paid to be invisible, who had looked anyway. The two versions were not the same story. They never are in places like this. But the private version has the advantage that all private versions have over public ones. It was formed by people who were actually there. That last observation is perhaps the most significant of all and the most honest. The people who served him knew him well enough to understand what he needed in order to function at his best. They had watched what happened when that was absent. They observed what changed when it was present. Their verdict on Camilla was, at its foundation, a verdict about what they saw that presence do to the man at the center of everything. He was, they concluded, better with her. Not perfect. Neither of them was that, and the household knew too much to mistake functioning well for being without flaw. But better, steadier, more capable of doing the work that had been given to him, for people whose job was to support that work. That observation settled over time into something they were willing to defend, not loudly, not in ways that invited argument, in the private, durable way that real assessments settle, not because the questions had been answered, but because the evidence had been long enough in view to trust. There is a particular kind of understanding that only develops in service. It is not the understanding of a biographer who reads letters and constructs meaning from distance. It is not the understanding of a journalist who arrives with questions already half-formed and leaves with quotes carefully selected to support them. It is the understanding of a person who has been in the same rooms at the same hours across years that do not compress into narrative but simply accumulate. The staff who served Charles across the decades of his life before kingship possessed this kind of understanding in abundance, and it shaped everything about how they saw Camilla. What they saw, stripped of the frameworks that the outside world imposed on her, was a woman navigating an extraordinarily difficult position with a degree of self-possession that many people in far easier circumstances would have failed to sustain. The hostility she faced was not abstract. It was constant and specific and publicly sanctioned in ways that made it almost socially respectable to despise her. People who had never met her, who knew nothing about her beyond a handful of photographs and the broad outline of a story that had been simplified beyond recognition, felt entirely comfortable expressing contempt for her with no apparent sense that contempt required justification. She lived inside that atmosphere. She woke up inside it every morning and went to sleep inside it every night. She read newspapers that used her name as shorthand for everything selfish and calculating and cold in modern womanhood. She encountered strangers whose faces arranged themselves into expressions of disapproval the moment they recognized her. She attended public events where the warmth that greeted Charles was calibrated to drop several degrees the moment the room's attention moved from him to her. And she continued. She continued appearing, she continued working, she continued being present in the ways that presence was required of her, without apparent collapse and without the spectacular acts of self-defense that many people in her position would have been forgiven for attempting. The staff who observed this found it difficult to dismiss, not because endurance is automatically a virtue, people endure terrible things for terrible reasons, but because the manner of her endurance said something about what she was made of. She did not become bitter in the ways that prolonged hostility tends to make people bitter. She did not become defensive in the ways that chronic criticism tends to produce defensiveness. She did not harden in the ways that years of being publicly despised tend to harden people. She remained, in the estimation of those who saw her at close range, essentially herself. And what she was, essentially, was not the figure the public had been given. One of the qualities that staff noted with particular consistency was something harder to name than warmth or kindness, though it encompassed both. It was a kind of groundedness, an absence of the quality that makes powerful and celebrated people exhausting to be around. The quality of needing the room to confirm their importance at regular intervals, the quality that produces a specific kind of exhaustion in the people paid to serve them, a depletion that comes not from physical labor but from the constant management of someone else's ego. Charles, whom the staff loved in their way and served with genuine loyalty, had his version of this quality. It was never malicious, and it was inseparable from the genuine sensitivity and intelligence that made him admirable. But it was there. The need for reassurance, the need for his enthusiasms to be met with enthusiasm, the need at a level he himself may not have fully recognized, for the people around him to reflect back a version of himself that he could feel settled about. Camilla did not have this quality in the same measure. She was not indifferent to what people thought of her. No person who has been as publicly condemned as she was could achieve true indifference. But she did not require the constant performance of approval from the people around her. She did not need the room. She came into spaces and occupied them without demanding that those spaces reorganize around her arrival. This is less common than it should be in environments like that one. Staff who had spent decades in royal service had encountered the full range of what entitlement looks like when it has been marinated in privilege across generations. And the full range ran from the relatively mild to the genuinely extraordinary. They had their private rankings. Camilla's position in those rankings was, by consistent report, surprisingly high, not because she was perfect, not because she never had difficult moments or expressed preferences in ways that required navigation, but because the baseline of how she moved through the world, the default register of her interaction with the people who served her, was one that the staff experienced as respectful in a way that was not performed. This mattered in ways that accumulated over time into something more significant than a pleasant working environment. It affected how people talked about her when she was not present. And in royal households, how people talk about you when you are not present is perhaps the most accurate measure of your real reputation, the reputation that exists beneath the official one, formed by people who have no strategic reason to flatter you, and every reason to be honest with each other. The question of Diana was never fully absent from these assessments, and honesty requires that it be addressed directly rather than handled at the edges. Diana was loved in ways that Camilla was not and would not be. And part of what made the staff's assessments of Camilla credible was that the people offering them were generally clear-eyed about this distinction. They did not claim that Camilla replaced Diana in the emotional register of the household. They did not suggest that the warmth people had felt for Diana was transferable, or that Camilla had somehow inherited it. The love that Diana inspired in the people who served her was specific to Diana, to her particular brand of luminous, sometimes chaotic, deeply human presence, and it remained specific to her even after she was gone. What the staff were describing when they spoke about Camilla was something different, not a replacement and not a comparison, a separate observation about a separate person in a separate set of circumstances. Camilla's relationship with the staff was not Diana's relationship with the staff, and the people who tried to evaluate it on those terms invariably ended up in confusion. She was not as spontaneously warm. She was not as visibly vulnerable in the ways that Diana's vulnerability had made people feel trusted. She did not produce the same quality of emotional intimacy that Diana had produced almost effortlessly with people she encountered, but she produced something else. Something more durable perhaps, if less spectacular. A consistency of consideration that did not depend on mood or moment or the particular chemistry of any given encounter. A reliability that people who had served across difficult years found quietly valuable. Diana's warmth was real and it was extraordinary, but it was also subject to the variations that come with extraordinary feeling. It could lift a room entirely, and it could just as easily be absent when the private weather had turned. Camilla's version of consideration was lower in temperature and more constant. It was there on the unremarkable Tuesday as reliably as it was there on the formal occasion. For people whose working lives were mostly unremarkable Tuesdays, that consistency was not nothing. The staff who had served both women and who were honest enough to hold both observations at once arrived at a conclusion that was uncomfortable for anyone invested in a clean narrative. Both things were true. Diana was extraordinary and loved. Camilla was different and in her different way good. The relationship the household had with each of them was not in competition. It was simply the record of two real people, neither of them the simplified figure the public had been offered. There is one final thing worth saying about what the staff of Charles's household thought of Camilla, and it concerns something that the years of public hostility made easy to overlook. She stayed. This sounds simple. It is not. The position she occupied for most of the relevant years, acknowledged but not official, present but not formally recognized, the subject of enormous and sustained public disapproval, was not a position designed to make staying easy. It was a position that would have given any reasonable person ample grounds for deciding that the cost was simply too high, that the scrutiny was too relentless and the acceptance too conditional, and the symbolic weight of being the woman who was blamed for a national fairy tale's ending was too much to carry indefinitely. If this story stayed with you, if it made you see something differently, or reminded you that the real history is almost never the headline version, then you already know what this channel is trying to do. We spend weeks on stories like this one, not the official version, not the version that was designed to be comfortable, the version that takes time to find. If you want more of that, subscribe. It's the only way to make sure the next one finds you. And if someone in your life would appreciate a story told this way, share it with them. That's how channels like this survive. We'll see you in the next one.